We'll see the weather turn drier and brighter, albeit with just 1 or 2 showers.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now today, as the situation in Ukraine worsens, we examine its geopolitics. We also look at our own energy security with leading MP Craig McKinley. And finally, we explore even UK drug policy. All that after the morning's headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Conflicting reports are emerging on whether the Ukrainian city of Kherson has been seized by Russian troops. UK intelligence shows Russian forces have entered, but the military situation remains unclear. The Ministry of Defence says the cities of Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol remain in Ukrainian hands despite heavy shelling. The convoy advancing on the capital, Kyiv, is also said to have made little progress over the past 3 days. Security Minister Damien Hines told GB News the UK is doing all it can to help Ukraine.
The situation we have now clearly is desperate for the people of Ukraine. That's why it's so important that we provide assistance both to Ukraine itself, but also to Poland and the other surrounding countries, and also that we are putting in place a big new humanitarian route, actually 2 new humanitarian routes, to make sure that our country is absolutely playing its part, along with friends and allies elsewhere, to make sure that we welcome and bring to safety people fleeing that conflict.
Ukraine's Ministry of Defence has posted a photo of a downed Russian jet. It says its forces destroyed 3 planes and 2 helicopters yesterday. Russia claims 500 servicemen have been killed during the conflict, while Ukraine puts the figure at 9,000. Athletes and from Russia and Belarus will not be allowed at the 2022 Winter Paralympics in Beijing. The International Paralympic Committee has reversed its original decision to allow them to compete under a neutral flag. That decision was met by criticism and the threat of a boycott. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now first, developments in Ukraine. A second round of peace talks will take place today between delegations from Ukraine and Russia as the fighting between the two enters its 8th day. The mayor of the southern city of Kherson has said his city has fallen to Russian forces, urging residents to obey Russian rule. The port city of Mariupol has sustained heavy shelling, with hundreds more feared dead. But the capital, Kiev, also suffered 4 major explosions last night. That 40-mile Russian convoy on the outskirts of that city, however, has stalled, reportedly due to Ukrainian resistance, mechanical breakdowns and congestion. Well, let's discuss some of these issues now with Philip Ingram, a former British military intelligence officer, who joins me in the studio now. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning, Tom.
We're hearing mixed reports here. Firstly, Kyiv is still in Ukrainian hands, although the Russians have been advancing more in the south. What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that the Ukrainians are defending Kyiv, which is the Russians' main effort, extremely well. The Russians have always had a secondary axis in the south. They want to try and build a land bridge between what they captured in 2014 in Crimea and up to the disputed Donbass region. And whilst they're having successes in taking over cities, they've only taken over 1 city so far on that route, and their progress is surprisingly slow for what you'd expect with the forces that they, on paper, could deploy.
It's interesting. I saw just this morning, actually, on Twitter, a really fascinating thread by a man named Trent Telenko. Now, he's a former US government defence quality auditor.
Yes.
And he threw up a picture that I believe we can show on screen now for those watching on their television, if we can get that up, of this, which is a Panzer S-1 wheeled gun missile system. But it's completely stuck in the mud.
Yes.
And what his contention is that unless you turn over, unless you maintain these machines, unless you turn the wheels over, for example, once a month, they degrade.
Yeah.
And the contention is that this means that these vehicles, many of them that the Russian army has, aren't particularly worthy in mud. So if we move to this next picture now, those watching on television can see that convoy outside of Kiev.
Yes.
Completely stuck on the road, unable, perhaps, to move through mud. Could this be why the Russian forces are still stuck in that debilitating convoy?
Well, I don't think it's down to just the mud. Wheeled vehicles and mud tend not to mix. Now, that vehicle that you showed there has got a fancy bit of kit on it that allows you to deflate the tyres slightly so that they go across mud in a much better way, and it's called a central tyre inflation system. And then you blow the tyres up again. However, if they're not maintained, and the American observer is quite right, the walls of the tyres can collapse, and therefore more air leaks out than you can pump in, and the wheels fall off, as we saw there, and it doesn't get out. But it highlights a problem with the logistics supporting of the vehicles and the maintainability and the fuel and all the rest of it. And the Defence Intelligence staff have put the report out last night saying that it's a lack of fuel, it's poor maintenance that is helping to cause that massive tailback that we're seeing, which is a militarily inept thing to see. It's a failure in command and control, and it's a failure in logistics on the Russian side.
It's so interesting because it does feed into all these stereotypes about Russia that we have, that they really like the big displays of strength. But when it comes to the particular, the detail, the maintenance, and indeed, frankly, the cash, let's not forget the Russian economy is about the same size as the Spanish economy, and yet they've tried to maintain this Soviet-style military. Are they sort of playing with a bit of a facade here?
Oh, complete facade, and clearly Putin has believed the facade himself, that his forces are more capable than they are. You know, something like that looks fantastic on a parade in Red Square, where it has to travel a total about 3 kilometres reliably, but to try and take it into those sorts of conditions in a combat environment where the Ukrainians are putting up such a sterling defence that they're forcing the organisations to have to try and deploy off-road to take different routes, otherwise they're getting killed, but they're killing themselves by getting stuck.
Although, are we being a bit Panglossian here? Are we being too optimistic? Because ultimately, the Russian troops are better equipped, even though their equipment is older, there's more of it, there are more of the Russians. They are going to win this fight in Ukraine, at least in the short term.
I'll start from the final bit. The Russians are not going to win. They have lost this. No matter what the outcome is, even if they capture all of the cities, they have lost it, because the Ukrainian people are fixed in the belief that they will resist until the very, very end. The paper analysis of saying the Russians have got 200,000 bits of this kit and the Ukrainians have only got 50,000 bits of this kit, therefore the Russians must win, missed the fact that actually of that 200,000 bits of this kit that the Russians have got, they can only man with experienced manpower that amount of it, they can only support logistically that amount of it, and they've only got people who are experienced in using military operations with that amount of it. So it could only be a very small amount. And the motivation of those that are maintaining it, that are operating it and all the rest of it is completely different to the motivation of those on the Ukrainian side who are fighting for their national survival, fighting for the survival of their families. And warfare at the end of the day isn't all about kit. The human piece is as important, if not more important. And that motivation, that backbone that the Ukrainian defenders have is something that the Russians are suffering.
And that seems to be the particular angle of British leadership and Western leadership. The idea that we can keep up Ukrainian morale, show that the world is with them, keep the West united and keep those sanctions ever increasing against the Russian state. That could have a material impact on how Ukrainians feel able to fight on the ground.
Well, it not could, it is. But the person who's keeping the Ukrainians' morale up, and is a lesson for all of our world leaders, is President Zelensky. He has gone from being someone that he didn't really feature even in Ukrainian thinking, to now being the pin-up leader of the globe and an example that we will quote for years, and the history books will quote as another global leader who's had a global impact.
Well, Philip Ingram, thank you very much for joining us this morning to talk through those issues. Really fascinating discussion there. Let's turn now to how Russia is thinking. Keir Giles is an author and expert on the Russian military with Chatham House and joins me now down the line. Welcome to the programme, Keir. I want to explore what Russia is trying to achieve here. What is the Russian objective? Is it to take over Ukraine? Is it to absorb some of Ukraine into its state? Is it to run a sort of Soviet satellite state there? What are they looking to do?
Well, you've heard President Zelensky referred to just now by Philip Ingram and his inspirational leadership. He says that Russia actually wants to erase Ukraine as a country and as a people. And that's actually not far off what President Putin seems to have laid out in all of his manifestos and all of his aims for this war and the next wars, which he thinks are going to come after that. He's talking about how Ukraine doesn't have the right to exist as a nation, was a fiction, was an invention. There's no such thing as a separate Ukrainian people. So yes, it does seem pretty clear that the aim, at least in Putin's mind, is to reverse what he sees as the mistakes that allowed Ukraine to become independent in the first place. Now, the problem is, as we've already seen, Russia might have been overconfident, thinking that it might have won this war easily because it believed its own propaganda, because it believed that Ukraine would not resist, that its army would not put up a fight, that its people would not actually object to Russian soldiers among them. The challenge now, of course, is they haven't won the war the smart way, and they might revert to doing it the hard way, bludgeoning Ukraine into submission and presenting President Zelensky with impossible choices by shelling and by missile attacks on civilian areas to maximize the civilian suffering and try to blackmail him into surrendering.
Now, we know that the Russian army is an army of conscripts, even though those who fight on the front line, I believe, have to volunteer for that. The army itself is a conscripted one. For those watching on television now, we can see just how far that army has got through, making lots of progress in the south and the southeast of the country, but and encroaching there upon Kyiv, but they've sort of been stalled up there in the north for a little bit of time. But talking about those soldiers, and there have been many videos on social media of these people who look relatively frightened in their own way, the Russian soldiers. Some of them barely stopped being children very recently. How much can we trust those social media videos as representative of the Russian troops as a whole?
Well, Tom, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, no, the Russian troops is not exclusively made up of conscripts, as once upon a time you might have expected it to be. There is a core of professional soldiers, and there's an open question as to whether we have actually seen those yet deployed against Ukraine. But for people who've been watching the Russian military fight for decades, as people like me, What's eerily familiar here is the way Russia opened its campaign and the exact same things that we saw in the move on Chechnya 28 years ago, where you had the same problem of isolated, confused, small units of conscripts who didn't know where they were, what they were doing, what was awaiting them, driving forward into the center of enemy towns and getting hammered, precisely because they hadn't been told that there was an enemy out there. And all of these soldiers that we've seen so far reporting what they were doing after becoming captured on social media, and all of the official releases from the Ukrainian government are repeating the same thing. Nobody told them where they were going. Nobody told them there was actually an enemy out there that wouldn't be welcoming them. But then we also need to remember how that campaign in Chechnya progressed from there. Russia got its act together and reverted to its default way of warfare, of terrorizing the civilian population, of flattening cities in order to crush resistance as ruthlessly as possible. And that is what we need to be alive and alert to for what might be awaiting Ukraine.
So things are going to get really quite ugly quite quickly. Is this a sign of sort of desperation from the Russians, or was this always the plan, that they would start trying to almost win over the Ukrainian people, and if things didn't go that way, if they weren't welcomed in as liberators, then the real bloody warfare begins?
Well, I've seen it suggested in a lot of places, and I do find it quite plausible that perhaps the Russian leadership did genuinely underestimate Ukraine's status and the views of its people and as an independent nation, and somewhere that would not welcome a Russian occupation. And again, Russia has form for this. There's a track record of failing to appreciate what they're sending their troops into, failing to appreciate that actually, no, people don't want Russian troops there. We've seen it before in Afghanistan, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, where Russia doesn't bother to appreciate and understand the human environment that it's sending its troops into. And the real test of that was if we look at their performance in Ukraine, where they worked extremely hard. In Syria, where they worked extremely hard to understand the human environment that they were going into and exploit it and work different factions against each other in order to achieve victories with less fighting. That's a huge contrast to what Russia does in its own neighborhood, where there's a certain amount of arrogance, thinking they already know it, so they don't need to do the research.
It's a fascinating situation, and a deeply concerning one if that escalation does take place in short order. We'll keep a very keen eye on it, I know. Well, for now, Keir Giles, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing and talking through those important issues. Now, let's turn away from Ukraine for a moment. A damning new report by the influential Public Accounts Committee has accused the government of having no reliable data of the cost of cutting Britain's carbon emissions in our drive to achieve net zero by 2050. The report said that the government has, quote, no clear plan for how the transition to net zero will be funded. Well, let's talk through this now with Craig McKinley, Conservative MP for South Thanet, a member of the Public Accounts Select Committee, and of course a leading member of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group as well. Welcome to the programme. First of all, this idea that the government has no clear plan of funding, I suppose to one extent, it's understandable that they don't. We don't know which new technologies may come along in the next few decades. 2050 is still quite a long way away. We don't know exactly the field that we'll be playing in by the time we get to the 2040s.
Well, I think you've got that absolutely right, Tom, but we seem to be in a phase of trying to pick winners, heat pumps, battery vehicles, and as you say, the technology may be in a completely different place in a decade or two time. One of the very interesting things a colleague put to me was, you look at a photograph of any high street in say 1902, and then move 28 years on to 1930, it's a very different looking high street because of the technological changes across those 28 years. But net zero 2050 is 28 years away from today. So government picking winners today, I think, is a mistake, because technology will find a better way. But we seem to be almost harking back to those old command economies that you've just been talking about, where we will be doing this by then, and we'll have 10,000 tractors and 500,000 tons of grain. We used to laugh at those type of economies, but we seem to be doing that here and now today. Now, the Public Accounts Committee reports can be a little bit dry, a bit lengthy, and dare I say, a little bit dull. But this one was very punchy, because it highlighted very clearly that the government really hasn't got a plan as to how we get to net zero at 2050. It doesn't know what it's going to cost, whether to the public purse in terms of what the government may spend on this, the infrastructure and all of that type of stuff that will be needed, or what it will cost you and I as personal taxpayers in our own domestic lives. So let me liken it, if I may, to being sort of transported to a new city. You land in the middle with no map, no GPS, and you're not allowed to ask anybody for any directions. The chance of actually getting to where you want to go, I would say, are pretty slim. So, my view throughout this is the net zero plan has not been thought about. It's not been costed. We don't know how we're going to get there. But all the same, because of the legislation and this arbitrary date we've put in place, we shall get there no matter what the cost. Seems to be the policy of government. It's not good enough. It needs to be better. And let's put this, overlay it with the UK's CO2 output is 1% of global CO2, where China's is close to 30. So let's just put that into context as what we're trying to achieve, while much of the world, frankly, is getting on with creating its economies, getting cheaper energy, and all the rest of it. That's not to say that the world shouldn't move together to make a better, cleaner planet. And there's lots of those ambitions that I fully agree with. But standing alone, a small outputter of CO2 with massive cost to individuals and probably the offshoring of just about every high energy intensive industry, which we're already seeing amongst steel and aluminium. And I wonder I worry for the ceramics industry, the glass industry, anything else that uses huge amounts of energy. So none of this has been thought through. We need cheap energy. We need available energy. And what is happening in Ukraine has highlighted we need energy security. We were actually given a great gift by Mother Nature, and that's lots of gas in the UK. I would recommend we use it.
Yes, and I know that there is a growing campaign amongst Conservative MPs, even people who would not have been saying this maybe even a year ago, that we should be exploring our shale reserves in the UK. But is there any chance, and just in the final minute of this conversation, I'm afraid, we're running short on time, what is the chance of the government taking this on? Because so far they've been reluctant.
Well, I'm always rather optimistic. I say that common sense usually prevails, but we've got something that is completely contrary to common sense, likely to be happening within the next few weeks. There has been an instruction by the Oil and Gas Authority to put cement concrete down one of the wells that have been tried by Quadrilla, to close it up, seal it permanently. That, to me, is total and utter madness, must be reversed, and we need a serious debate about whether shale gas can be the solution. It worked in America, and thank heavens it did, because LNG ships are currently coming across the Atlantic to our rescue in the face of a serious gas price crisis across Europe.
It does seem very peculiar that the green solution here is to import American gas rather than producing our own. But for now, Craig McKinley, thank you for talking us through those issues here on The Briefing. Really appreciate your time this morning. Now, finally, in the programme today, a new report from the Higher Education Policy Institute has today suggested universities with a zero-tolerance approach to drugs are doing more harm than good. Now, this is because these policies make students fearful that if they come forward for help, they'll be punished. And the report argues that a more tolerant, health-focused approach to drug taking could combat, on campus, could help combat the problem more effectively, as it would give more priority to preventing harm by drug use, as opposed to preventing drug use altogether. Well, Ant Lahain is an advisor at harm reduction organisation Drugs and Me, and a regular commentator. Welcome to the programme. Is this unusual for the higher for HEPI? It's a respected think tank to come out with this sort of report.
I think it's quite unusual, but all credit to them. I think that the sort of conversation is showing now that the current approach to drugs is not working. That goes for poorer communities, older people, but also for students too. 16% of people polled in this report said that they were having drug issues but refused to call an ambulance. So there are clear consequences to the zero-tolerance approach at universities and the impact that is having on students. First and foremost, universities should be there to protect students, to protect their well-being, and currently the zero-tolerance approach is not doing that. Students are losing their lives, losing their livelihoods, and it's time we got a grip on this crisis. So all credit to HEPI for coming out and, rubbishing the zero tolerance approach, which we know doesn't work.
It's interesting because I was reading recently about what happened in the Second World War, not with regard to drugs, but with regard to venereal disease. Yes. And those troops that practiced abstinence, or preached abstinence, I should say, had a much higher incidence of venereal disease than those that were handed out protection and contraception. And it's almost like we learnt this lesson 70 years ago when it comes to harm reduction in the field of the armed forces. But we're not taking a harm reduction approach, not elimination, but reduction approach. And that's having terrible consequences when it comes to drug policy.
That's absolutely correct. So I'd always advocate for a model rooted in health and not criminalisation. There are some really easy steps that could be taken to protect students. In Bristol University, for example, they've teamed up with the local drug treatment agency to provide drug checking kits, drug testing kits, providing sort of education and advice to students. Let's not beat around the bush. You know, students are going to take drugs whether they're illegal or not. The ages between 18 and 22 are quite difficult times, you know, growing up. So I think we need to protect these students. A lot of these people will be taking drugs for the very first time. How are they to know, for example, an ecstasy pill might have 4 doses, 4 times the regular dose, and if they take that in one go or take 2, they might pass away, and their friends won't call an ambulance because of the criminalisation. They don't want to be thrown out of university. They don't want to end up in prison. So yeah, we need a different approach, not just in universities, but beyond that. Yes.
Well, I suppose that when you're referring to those kind of drugs where it's completely unregulated in a black market, you don't know the quantity of things, that's where some of the real danger of these things takes place. Do you think as a society we're starting to recognise this? Is there any chance of broader policy change in the near future?
Well, I hope so. The government recently released a drug strategy. Now, when they released it, there was the sort of classic tough on crime, Boris Johnson dressing up as a police officer. But actually, if you scratch away at the surface a little bit, the policies were quite good. We are moving towards decriminalisation. Drug checking, as in where you can go and test your substances, is happening. Police and crime commissioners are very behind the move. So we are moving in the correct direction. We're just stuck in a little bit of political difficulty whereby Labour and the Tories want to seem tough on crime, and unfortunately, people who use drugs are the first victims of that. Now, Labour have been just as guilty as the Conservatives at playing this kind of card and, championing a sort of tired drum of zero tolerance and criminalisation, which is a proven failure.
Well, that is fascinating, that the headline of the policy can sometimes be different from the detail of the policy underneath. It suggests to me that the people in power know what they would like to do in an ideal world.
Yes.
But given perhaps the media, perhaps I'm at fault here, perhaps the tabloid media is at fault as well. Given that, they prefer to dress it up in a different way. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme here. But for now, Ant Lahain, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing. That's it for the programme. Coming up next, it's To The Point with Patrick Christie's and Mercy Moroki. But first, it's the weather.
Hello, good morning. I'm Aidan McGiven. A dull and damp start for most of us. Frost-free, however, with the extensive cloud overnight. And then it does turn a little brighter in some places later this afternoon. But at the moment, there's a weather front crossing the country. Very slowly because it's coming up against high pressure to the east. And it's a weakening feature. However, it is bringing an extensive area of cloud and outbreaks of rain to Scotland, western parts of England, as well as Wales. Hill fog as well, but that area of cloud and rain narrowing, and so it's less extensive by the afternoon, and that means that parts of eastern England will brighten up. Plenty of sunshine here, highs of 10 to 13 Celsius. Where it's raining across central parts of the country, 9 or 10 degrees, but by the end of the afternoon, West Wales, Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, southwest England also sees brighter skies developing to the rear of the front, and a few showers starting to arrive. Most of those showers stay offshore overnight and inland, I think, for Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, Wales and the southwest under clear skies. A touch of frost is possible, also for East Anglia. But away from those areas, we keep the cloud, we keep those outbreaks of rain going, very slowly edging east, so that it's the eastern Scotland, northeast England, into the Midlands and the southeast where we'll see a lot of cloud and outbreaks of rain during Friday morning. The rain tending to be on and off, but it will be fairly persistent for eastern Scotland, northeast England, and it will be falling as snow over the tops of the Grampians. Brighter weather, meanwhile, for western Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, western England. Temperatures typically up at 9 or 10 degrees in the south, 7 to 8 degrees further north. Those temperatures head slightly downwards during Saturday and Sunday, but at the same time, most places will see the weather turn dry.